Hello, everybody. I'm David. I'm part of the Australian Student Christian Movement. We are here with Professor John Langmore, who's been nice enough to join us from Melbourne. Served in Federal Parliament for Canberra 5 terms, worked for the United Nations, is now at the University of Melbourne creating a Peace Centre, very important work. Lucy, can you please do acknowledgement for country before we go any further?
Yes, we're all thankful to be on the lands that we are on, and because of Zoom, we're in different places in these lands now called Australia. So we just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of wherever we are. You probably know who they are. I'm on Guyabal Jarraware land up here in southeast Queensland, now known as Toowoomba. And I do thank the elders past, present and emerging because they are looking after the place. They have looked after it, and we are glad to be guests on that country. And anybody viewing, we acknowledge if you have any traditional custodian ancestry, and I know that there is a welcome there to us. Thank you for it, and we look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you for that, Lucy. The other thing to mention too, because a big part of this presentation conversation will be about peace, it's also important to note that we know that when it comes to Indigenous people, there has been a lot of conflict between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people across the world, and in terms of taking land, conflicts that are still going on, conflicts that haven't been resolved. So I thought we just want to mention that as well. Professor John, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be talking to a student Christian movement meeting because, or Zoom meeting, because SCM was central to my own development. I really learned how to think through SCM, I think. And my parents had met in the SCM and pushed me very hard to join it. And because they were pushing so hard, I resisted. But towards the end of my undergraduate work, I did join and really felt very at home and was stimulated to think and discuss and have wonderful conversations. And I think the SCM has a great tradition, and I'm very glad to know that you're keeping it going in Queensland. Anyway, one of the things that one learned in SCM was the importance of trying to find ways of seeking peace and justice. Peace and justice are major concepts in both the Old and the New Testament. Earlier in the year on Anzac Day, I was asked to speak at St. Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne about peace. And I went through several books in the Bible and realized how commonly peace is discussed in the Bible. And the most important occasion when it's discussed is when Jesus, on the day of the resurrection, came to meet his disciples. And the first thing he said to them is, "Peace be with you." And that's an indication of how centrally he regarded the concept of peace. Now, of course, peace means different things to different people, and we can all recognize the diversity of the concept, but I take that to be clear affirmation of the importance of peace to Jesus. And one of the striking things about the search for peace is that it's really something that most people want. You don't. It's not something that's in the bidding of Christians only. In other religions and in people who have no religion but who want the best for humanity in their own philosophical terms, also mostly want peace. So the great majority of people want peace, and it's something that all of us can cooperate in trying to achieve. And having said that, it's shocking, really, to realize how wayward societies have been, how frequently they've gone to war, and how we're still continuing to do that now. If we were serious about wanting peace, then we would not be doing many of the things that we are doing. And I think it's very important to think carefully about that. When people are in Parliament, or when they're talking about safety, they're talking about wanting security. And of course, security is centrally important to all of us. But the question is, how do you achieve security? And of course, it is best achieved in peaceful situations. Yet, we're presented time after time by politicians from most sides that will be more secure when we have more military expenditure. And military expenditure is not a way of keeping secure ultimately. It's a way of antagonizing countries with which we might be in competition. And we've had a particularly serious example of that in the last three weeks, with the announcement of the plan to purchase 8 nuclear-driven submarines at enormous cost, at the cost of breaking an agreement with France, and at the cost of putting ourselves in a situation where we'll become obedient servants of the United States, because we won't be able to do it ourselves. We're not a nuclear country. Now, of course, we might be able to become one over the next 20 or 30 years. But if we were, what would be happening is we would be contributing to the spread of nuclear technology. And if we were really serious about wanting peace in the world, we would be seeking with all the good sense and the intelligence and the commitment that we can muster to finding ways of disarming from nuclear weapons and from nuclear technologies generally. There's been a debate during the last 3 weeks whether the nuclear submarines break the non-proliferation treaty. Well, they don't directly, because they don't automatically have to carry nuclear weapons, but they do, regrettably, use very high-grade uranium, very highly refined uranium, and it's outside the control of the Atomic Energy Agency, the International Atomic Energy Authority, and that means that it would be a way in which an unscrupulous country, and I'm not suggesting Australia is basically unscrupulous, could get nuclear weapon grade uranium without it being under the control and the reportage requirements of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So that seems to me to be not only a very unwise step, but to risk contributing to proliferation of nuclear technology. It's not the only reason why one might be skeptical of this initiative. It is hugely costly, and the people who know something about it say that each of those submarines, those 8 submarines, might well cost 50% more than the French ones would have. But they don't attempt to justify why we need 8 of those, or previously why we needed 12 of the French ones. Now, I don't want this to be a talk principally about submarines, but it's been hugely on my mind and on the mind of many other people since it was announced. And I think since it's probably the most important military decision that's been taken by Australia since 1945, it's important to talk about it. What if I can go back in a way earlier in the discussion? It seems to me vital that our foreign policy should be aiming for peace. If we are aiming for peace, then we'll be seeking ways of minimizing our military expenditure, consistent with being able to defend ourselves from external threat. But really, Australia at this stage is not threatened by anybody. And it's highly unlikely that even in the midterm, that any country would want to invade us. Therefore, we are in a pretty strong position to be modest in our in our military expenditure, and to give all the attention we can to trying to minimize conflict. Now, let me move beyond the submarines and talk a bit more about how we might contribute to peace building. The major defense from threat internationally is through diplomacy, to build up the number of diplomats and the skills of the diplomats in negotiating, in conversation, in dialogue's the best word, in dialogue and negotiation with governments of other countries. And the astonishing thing that I found and colleagues found in a research project that we did over the last couple of years was that Australia has been reducing the proportion of its total Commonwealth expenditure on diplomacy. Since 1995-96 through to now, the proportion of Commonwealth funding on diplomats has been halved. So it was very low to start with. In 95-96, it was just under 0.4% of total Commonwealth expenditure. Now it's coming down to just under 0.2% of Commonwealth expenditure. Now that simply isn't reasonable, and it is vital, if you care about trying to achieve peace for Australia, to build up the number and the skills and the number of diplomatic postings overseas that Australia maintains. At present, we've got fewer overseas posts than most members of than all but one member of the G20, the group of large countries, wealthy countries, and large developing countries. There's only one country that has fewer diplomatic postings than we do, Saudi Arabia. And we have fewer than most OECD countries. They're all the wealthy countries plus a few developing countries. It's simply, if we can afford to spend more on the military, we can absolutely certainly afford to spend more on our diplomats. At present, as I said, we're spending 0.2% of Commonwealth expenditure on diplomacy. We're spending over 2%. That's more than 10 times more on defence, and it's going up, whereas diplomacy is coming down. So one thing to aim for is less military expenditure and a lot more in due course on diplomacy. You can only build it up gradually as people can be recruited and trained and posted, and learn to speak other languages and so on. So it takes time. That's a central requirement for improved peace building capacity. Now, another thing that can be done about peace building capacity is what I'm centrally involved in at present, which is to establish a non-government peace building unit. The University of Melbourne has agreed to do this. University of Queensland, by the way, does very good work on research and education about conflict and peace building too. So you're fortunate to have that established in Queensland. But Melbourne hasn't had a centre like that so far. And the Melbourne one is not only going to do research and teach, but it's also going to be involved in attempting to engage in conflict situations to try and find the people there who want peaceful outcomes and to find ways of supporting them and strengthening their capacity. There are centres like this in many countries. Australia hasn't had one which has done all three of those functions: research, engagement, and education before. And so this is a step forward, I hope. We're hopeful of recruiting 6, 7, 8 researchers and practitioners to do those tasks for a start. We are underway this year in an introductory way, having dialogue about Myanmar, a situation where the army took over on the 1st of February and has caused a lot of loss of life. And there is a united government made up mainly of the people who were elected late last year, but also representatives of ethnic groups that weren't part of that. So there are hopeful capacities gradually forming in Myanmar, but the army so far is very entrenched and is not being attentive to the loss of life that they're causing. That's one place. Another place that we've just begun to be taken interest in is Afghanistan. Everyone's been concerned about what's happening in Afghanistan. Now it's a different situation because the Taliban are now the government. What should happen there? Without aid, there will be massive hunger and illness and so on because Taliban don't have many sources of finance. Should aid donors contribute to humanitarian relief in Afghanistan or not? Many countries that have been not pouring, that's too strong a word, but have been supporting humanitarian activity into Afghanistan are now debating what to do. Well, we're going to have a meeting, as many meetings are being held in different parts of the world on the same subject. Should external donors contribute to easing the humanitarian difficulties that are already becoming quite major in Afghanistan? So that's another area which needs attention. A third one that we've done a little on is South Sudan, where there's been a civil war, a terribly destructive civil war. There are numbers of people there who are honestly and imaginatively trying to find ways of changing the structure of government so that there's more autonomy at a provincial level. And so people who feel that they need it can have more control over their own government without feeling the need to go to war with groups in other parts of the country. Anyway, that's another very complex and now very very stressed country. And one reason why that's of some concern to Australia, it seems like a long way away, is that a lot of people of South Sudanese origin have come to live in Australia, and they still care about their country. They left to escape with their lives, but they want to be peacefully involved in some way in what happens there, and we've been talking with them about ways that could help. They could help. Anyway, look, perhaps that's enough of an introduction, David. I've covered some big issues at a rather quick way, but anyway, that might generate some comments or questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Lucy, do you have any sort of comments or questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Langmore, for your comprehensive suggestions that are very practical regarding, the subject of peace building. I think that very early on you mentioned about your journey of being encouraged and taught, in a sense, to think with the Australian Christian student movement. So I was just thinking in terms of acting our way into a new way of thinking. So I think your suggestions are practical there, and I think, things will gain more momentum as people do the actions. But one thing that struck me towards the end of what you were saying is there's a great disparity of funding between, peace building and militarization. And I think at the core of the issues are like this violence and fear. So is that something you could perhaps speak to a little bit about violence and fear, how that plays, and perhaps some practical suggestion as to how your ideas work in with that?
That's a centrally important issue, Lucy, and thank you for such a penetrating question. Of course, it really relates to the whole issue of well-being, doesn't it? Fear is a very powerful motivator, which all of us experience to some extent. The question is, what can be done to enable people to live less fearful lives, and that, of course, depends on the whole issue of economic security and social security as well. We are, of course, relatively privileged in Australia, and we have relatively good quality income support and relatively good quality health services and relatively good quality education services, all of which are constructively engaged in improving our well-being, and that's fundamental to to enabling people to feel secure where they are, and when they feel more secure, then they are also able to be more neighbourly, to be more kindly, and to be more supportive of each other. In a way, I think that there has been some good consequence from the pandemic, because quite a number of us are now, I think millions of people are probably more aware of the needs of their neighbours than they were before. I don't think that it would have been infinitely better if we hadn't had it, but it is possible to see that as one side product that may be of benefit. Of course, the cost of the lockdowns has been that people have been isolated from each other, and that's really awful. I think very destructive. Anyway, because we know that each of us is to some extent threatened by the virus, we're all, lots and lots of people, I think, have learned to try and be kindlier to other people, and that's of benefit. But their background points behind the one of how do we contribute to reducing fear of external forces to the country. Again, Australia is relatively fortunate. There is no country, I think, and it is an area in which I'm a professional, that any country really wants to invade Australia. I don't think China does. China's got many things on its mind, and it's far from being a perfect country. And it has acted improperly in taking over islands in the South China Sea, or in making threatening gestures towards Taiwan, or in treating the Uyghurs absolutely unjustly, or to the Tibetans absolutely unjustly. All of those things are true. That, however, doesn't mean that it's plotting to invade Australia, and I've seen no evidence at all that it's plotting to invade Australia. China's way of exerting power, its traditional way over centuries, over millennia in fact, has been to want obeisance from the countries around it without invading them, and I think that's what's more likely to be threatened. Of course, we may need to, if Indonesia was threatened from China, we might be asked by the Indonesians to help them resist, but I don't think Indonesia is threatened either. The country that's most threatened by China, apart from Taiwan, is Vietnam. The thing is, one thing to remember is that China hasn't had a single war since 1979, and that was with Vietnam. The United States has been at war almost continuously in the whole of the last 40, 50 years. China has not been, and that's one recent indicator of the fact that they're not, on the whole, oriented towards military activity. I don't suggest that we not be careful. We are. Jesus told us to be wise as serpents and as humble as doves, and I think that's very good advice. So it means use your minds to think and observe and analyze and so on. But let's do that with as little prejudice as we can and as much accurate knowledge. So all of those points are relevant to your answer, but your question, you could run a whole university course on it.
Yeah, I have a little comment on that, because there are various kinds of invasion, not necessarily militaristic, because there's, economic invasion, I guess you could say, and perhaps, that's an area like with if you are, in a sense, founding a peace-building entity, and I think that's great because a lot of different groups could join, individuals and groups could join in with the spirit of what you're doing, and perhaps practically as well. But with other aspects of peace building, like perhaps environmental issues and economic issues. So with the diplomacy, you could also have those sorts of principles brought into other spheres involved with peace building. Is that something that perhaps is in your vision?
Oh, sure. You're quite right about that. That's one reason why the Australian Foreign Affairs Department is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, because that economic dimension is very important and has, in part, similar kind of diplomatic issues as does political relations. But if you're thinking of China's influence in Australia, that too is something of which caution is required. But of course, China's not the only country that tries to influence other people. Australia doesn't do much of it. I think Australia ought to do more of it, quite frankly. But anyway, the British and the French and the Germans and the Americans, and particularly the Americans, spend quite a lot on trying to promote their countries and understanding of their countries and their cultures and etc. And also to support their own industries in their attempts to expand exports. And of course, Australia does that too. And the actual economic relations between Australia and China are so far hugely to Australia's advantage. I mean, we export far more to them than they export to us.
Thank you for that, Professor. Can I ask you about with peace and religion? Do you find that religion helps with peacemaking, or it's more of a hindrance?
I argue that it's much more of a help, but it isn't always so. I mean, religions, including Christianity, have fundamentalists who are very ideologically rigid, and the history of Christianity is full of, as was the history of the Jewish nation in Old Testament times, it has many examples of going to war and leading ways into war, and that's something I think of which Christians have to be ashamed and very skeptical about. But I mean, I think our guide is Jesus' life, and Jesus' life was free of violence. I mean, the only violence I can think of is when he overturned the tables in the temple, the traders' tables in the temple. But that wasn't violence against other people. And even when he was being arrested in the garden, he healed the ear of the person who one of his disciples had cut the ear off from. I mean, Jesus' example is of a non-violent man, and I think that's the centrally important point for us.
When you were talking about sort of the peace building and the Peace Centre at the university, when you look back at, say, when you were in Parliament, at the UN, and now with the centre, which area can you sort of do more for peace? Is politics too political to be able to achieve something? Is the UN too bureaucratic, or at the university? Where can you do more for peace across those three spheres?
They're all important, David, and like several of the epistle writers say, some are called to be teachers, and some are called to be something, and some are called to be something else, and so on. I think every area, we all have specific skills, and they differ, for which thank God. And the question is the way we can best use the skills and capacities that we've been given, and that's a sort of philosophical part of the answer. In my own experience, I did try when I was in politics, and at the UN certainly, and when I was teaching at Melbourne University before this centre came up, to have an approach that was contributing in various ways to peace building. I mean, clearly that's important in politics. That it is not honouring other people to behave like politicians, like many politicians behave in question time. If they, it seems to me, I shouldn't be too dogmatic about it myself, but it seems to me that they should be learning to ask questions without hostility and learning to give answers without hostility. And at the UN, that was a diplomatic job. I mean, 193 countries, all the member states having a right to expect things from the secretariat. I was in the secretariat working on social development, and they would come with their different requests, and we had to think as imaginatively as we were humanly possible to do, to find ways of implementing things that have been requested to do, or to say why we couldn't do them. I mean, you can learn a lot, can't you, about, I mean, politeness is just one level of diplomacy. And if you're seriously interested in human relationships, as Christians we ought to be, then trying to find ways that contribute to harmony is part of the responsibility of all of us. Some of us will be better at it than others, and all of us will fail sometimes. But we need to keep on wrestling with that and seeking advice when we think we could do with it, you know.
Thank you. Lucy, did you have a question or comment?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned the word imaginative, because I think, you know, imagination is a very important thing. You know, imagining a more cooperative human future, all those kind of better things, you know, more community thinking. So, you know, imagination is very important. Of course, the actions that are inspired by that. So there's a bit of a loop there between, you know, action and imagination and thinking. And I think needing that diversity and the multilateral approaches to things, because you alluded to that little passage that talked about, you know, some people of this, you know, they're the apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, teachers. There's variety there and variety in the creation. So sometimes that can be a little bit difficult, because the energy seems to get diffused, you know, if you're a small group, that you've got a limited number of people and resources in a sense. So could you perhaps speak a little to that? And just one other quick thing about respect. You're talking about politeness and respect. At the beginning, we had our, you know, acknowledgement of country. So also in the vision of your peace building entity project, Is there an avenue for inviting our Indigenous Australians to contribute and perhaps, you know, their ideas to be incorporated into the vision?
Look, they're both excellent questions or comments, really. It is an issue for all of us right through our lives, isn't it, to try and discern what are the priorities, and often they're not clear. I mean, we live in a very complex world, and it's hard to sort out in through all the pressures that are on us and people around us and so on. What are the highest priority things on which to be working, and it's harder still to do that together when there's a group of you in a church or an SCM or whatever. But that's what we have to try and do. And I mean, it's not doesn't have to be a deep anguish, but it does have to be something that we attempt to do periodically, at least. It's what some of us do in our morning prayers every morning. It requires discernment, and it is right to seek priorities. And they're not always clear. And sometimes we think we're on the right track, and then for some reason we realize that it's not the highest priority, or it's not working or whatever. Then we have to change. So I think that degree of flexibility is pretty important. You've got so many good questions, Lucy. We could talk for a long time. In relation to Indigenous affairs, we're acutely aware of that. And one of the good things that's happening in Australia at this moment is that more Australians, I think, whether they're from an Indigenous background or from a settler background, are realizing that the settler settlement of Australia has been a disaster for Indigenous people, and to try and find the ways of addressing that huge injustice is enormously important. We're working with someone who's a rather skillful mediator, an Indigenous person who's a skillful mediator, and to work on ways in which, if we can, find ways of being helpful in addressing that conflict. It's something that hundreds of thousands of Australians have to be aware of, and many good things are happening. One is that there's a greater attention to honesty about history, and that's very important. Another is to honour Indigenous tradition, and that can be very important too. So that's another big subject, and there are some real prophets from both sides of that who've given great leadership, and there's more recognition of the contribution they've made, and I'm glad to say many churches are involved in that. I'm a member of the Uniting Church, and it's actively engaged in that, but numbers of churches, numbers of denominations are.
And Professor, when it comes to your centre, practically how would it help? So take, for example, Yemen, or let's say if there was a conflict between Pakistan and India, just as random examples. Practically, what does the centre do? What could they do?
Well, that's a good question. We're just at the beginning of attempting to look at that. One reason being that there's a visiting fellow at Melbourne University from India, and we're trying to set up with him, through him, and he's worked on this before. He's a social scientist, a cross-disciplinary social scientist at a university in Assam, in the east of India, who earlier in his career was involved in dialogue between India and Pakistan, funded by a Swiss philanthropic organization, and what they did was set up discussions between Indians and Pakistanis about how to minimize the risks of both countries having nuclear weapons. That happened about 15 years ago, or over a period around 15 years ago. It's gone quiet again since then, and so he's working for us for 2 days a week, and while he's on sabbatical with us, and he's been in touch with numbers of people, not only in India and Pakistan, but 2 or 3 people from Japan and someone from Singapore and so on. And what we will do for a start is hold a round table with people who've got technical expertise in this area, and we hope to do that next year. We hope to have a series of roundtables, first of all with experts, then later with politicians, to try and generate a situation where more concrete consideration can be given to steps that might reduce risks, improving communication, reducing the number of weapons, steps of that kind. Promises no first use. India is one of the 2 countries, I think, only that promise no first use of nuclear weapons. The other one is China, by the way. No other country so far have promised no first use. America, numbers of people in America have been trying to persuade Biden to do this, but he hasn't so far agreed. It involves quite significant changes of strategy to promise no first use, but it sounds like a pretty reasonable step to take to someone who really is opposed to use of nuclear weapons.
Indeed. And Professor, you mentioned before that we spend far more on the military than the diplomacy. What's the rationale? If you ask them directly, why are they doing that if they want peace so much? What do they say?
Well, I haven't had that debate recently, although I did when I was in Parliament. And actually, when I was in Parliament, I had some interesting conversations with generals and so on, admirals and whatever, because they lived in my electorate. The defence headquarters in Canberra are in the electorate that I represented, and I used to talk in Parliament about the importance of cutting military expenditure, and some of them weren't too impressed with that. In fact, one person stood against me just on that ground, that I was arguing for too big a cut in military expenditure. He didn't make headway, I'm glad to say, but my impression is that many senior officers in the military don't want war. they don't want their boys and girls to be killed. They would far rather that they were never used in violent conflict. So at their best and at the foundation point, they also are in favor of trying to find ways of reducing the risk of war. And I'm not saying that all of them are, I don't think all of them are, but some are. And that I regard as a sign of hope. And
Lucy, do you have any questions, comments?
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts just regarding, just very briefly, I was going to say that I am representing the Anabaptist Association of Australia and New Zealand. So I come from that peace churches or peace cultures environment. And also I participate in a group called Scarred Tree Indigenous Ministries based in Glebe in Sydney. So living in Queensland, I've recently moved up here, etc. And I think one of the things about talking about getting panels of experts together to discuss things. So within that sort of context, sometimes there are people that are not necessarily that highly educated or involved at that level of discussion, but do have some opinions that could be thought of as expert or new or imaginative. And, you know, the Indigenous community often comes up with those sorts of things because they are more communal minded than necessarily that individualistic stance and, you know, that matrix that the more Western cultures sort of seem to come from. So is there scope for including those sorts of voices to be a multi-voiced approach to that?
Of course, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, they're often very authentic voices, and one listens with respect to what they say.
Professor, with the starting the, I'm trying to be a practical person, with starting the Peace Centre, how does that work? You go up to the university and say, you know, peace is a good thing, we want a centre, let's do it. Is there pushback? Is it incredibly complicated to start it? Do you have to prove that, because you would think on paper creating a peace centre would be a good thing because we all want peace. Practically, how difficult is it?
Well, it wasn't absolutely straightforward. We did it in an evolving process. We first of all, 3 or 4 of us got together and researched what, in fact, it turned out to be 7 other countries did about peace building. And then we asked the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, would they help pay for the cost of getting us to do this? They gave us 50,000. It wasn't much, but anyway, it was a symbol that they were supportive. And we wrote a report with a chapter each on what 7 different countries were doing. Australia's got a rotten record in peace building, actually, but many other countries. We looked at Britain and Norway and Canada and the US. Even the US has more activity on peace building than Australia does. And the Philippines, because of course they've got a problem in Southern Islands, Mindanao. South Africa, and what I think that's the list. And they've done different things in different ways. So, and then having done that, we said, well, could we do a study of Australian diplomats' handling of conflict? And we applied for university funding for that. The Australian Research Council and despite the fact that one of the assessors of our application said that this is a dream team, nevertheless, we didn't win an award. However, DFAT for that gave us 125,000, and Melbourne University gave us 125,000. So we had some decent money to help pay for it, and we surveyed about 120 diplomats and did careful summaries of what they'd said or reports on what they'd said, and then analysed those and did a report for DFAT. And one of our recommendations in that was that there should be a non-government Peacebuilding Centre dedicated to peace building. So we'd done a lot of background work. We'd looked at these things in other countries. We'd looked at where Australia was at, and this was one of the gaps we saw in what Australia was doing. So we were very well prepared, and then I, with someone else, went to see the head of my department, and then the dean of the arts faculty, and then people at the top, close to the top of the university administration, trying to put the case to them. We had to prepare a business proposal. When lots of universities have scope for people who want to establish a centre for research on one thing or another, and we were in that category. And then that was considered by a committee and so on. So it took about a year to go through that process. But in the end, the university and finally the Vice-Chancellor, no one held it up beyond the proper time required for careful bureaucratic evaluation. So but it was about a year between when we started asking for support and when we finally got it. And then the Vice-Chancellor announced it in April this year. So, but it wasn't a matter of struggling against obstruction or opposition. I was absolutely relieved to find that we got support the whole way. That the evaluations were just, were we going to spend the money wisely, and had we worked out what we'd do with it, and how would it work? The big question at the top management was, is it risky for the university to do this? And I think they had both in mind risk to the people involved if they were going to get involved in a conflict, and the political risk of being involved in issues that might have political debates around them. Anyway, it was set up in a way that minimizes those risks. I mean, we've got a board representative of people from across the university, not just from social and political sciences, but also from law and from medicine and from senior administrators. They have responsibility for keeping watch on what we're doing and reporting. I'm actually chair of the board. I don't aspire to be the director of the centre because I'm not actually a trained peace builder. I mean, I'm trained as a social worker and as an economist. But as you can tell, I've tried to approach the work I do as a politician and as a diplomat at the UN in a peace building way. So I'm not ignorant of peace building, but I haven't been a professional peace builder myself. And so the director, when we have money for the directorship, will have to be someone who's worked in that area for a large part of their professional life. And it may well be someone from overseas. Who knows? Anyway, we've got to get the money first, and then we'll advertise and we'll see who applies.
Thank you for that. For those that are watching or that will watch this recording and be like, oh, why didn't you ask the professor this or that? You can still ask if you contact the Australian Student Christian Movement, because we really want people to get really engaged in the work that the professor's doing. So don't just watch the recording and go, oh, that was nice, see you later. If you have any questions, comments, please write to us, because we can forward them on to the professor. And we need money for this. Peace costs money, and so please support the centre. I'm mindful of the time, but before we finish, Lucy, did you have any sort of final comments?
Yeah, just a closing comment. The mention of risk. I think, if you think of risk and you think of faith, faith is kind of risky. And if we had all the answers and we knew how to do it, you think we would have had a better world by now. We are, as human beings, completely imaginative, but also we have some weird limitations, and we can see the state that the world largely is in now. But Jesus, as Christians, Jesus wasn't called the Prince of Peace for nothing. So I think being discipled, as you mentioned, to his life, his ways and his teachings are really important. And to the other representatives, the religions that we do have dialogue with, there's a countercultural thing. And if we're joining together in peace building, it's counter to the dominant cultures. So I think, if we're joining together in unity about such projects, it's a wonderful thing. And thank you very much for your discussion, your ideas, the project, and I hope there's a lot of support for that, because we really need it.
Well, thank you both for your interest and your very penetrating questions, very substantial questions and comments.
Well, thank you so much for joining, Professor. Really, really, really do appreciate it. And thank you.
I'm very happy to be called John.
Okay, excellent. John, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, David. Thanks, Lucy. Okay.